Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield audio podcast.
I want to talk to you in this podcast about a trend that many of us have anticipated for years and which really culminated in an article by some Cambridge scholars, by some British scholars in the Journal of Medical Ethics. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. For years, those of us who are pro-life, those of us who believe that human life is sacred and should only be brought to an end in acts of defense or punishment for criminal activity, have believed that if we as a society executed the next generation, essentially, for our own comfort. Now, that's harshly stated, but if we engaged in abortions for vanity reasons, for comfort reasons, for economic reasons, for any reasons that were beyond the threat to a mother's life, which everybody, as far as I know, believes is a legitimate case for an abortion, that we would somehow harden the consciences of our society, that we would somehow expand those rights to sacrifice the next generation, based on our own comfort and our own need. And the great concern was that we would become increasingly, call it what you will, barbarian, increasingly mercenary, that we would increasingly, take the next generation to the extent that we felt like it was necessary to preserve certain rights and privileges for this generation. Well, it all sounded extreme. I have spent many hours sitting over a coffee talking to friends who do not share my views, and they said, that's just extreme. That's never going to happen. Well, not to crow or not to say that my tribe is always right, but just recently in the Journal of Medical Ethics by some British scholars have written an article in which they have argued for the legitimacy of killing babies after they're born. Now, I'm sure you think I'm making this up, and I know this is a macabre subject to talk about, but if we don't talk about it before it becomes law, what's going to happen after it does, if it should? The reality is that two very intelligent, very well-educated, very respected medical professionals in England who are Cambridge professors have written an article called After Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live? Now, when I first read this, I thought perhaps they were being provocative to make a point. But they say, listen to this now, that what we call after-birth abortion, or the killing of a newborn, should be permissible in all the cases where abortion is, including where the newborn is not disabled. They call this after-birth abortion. And their perspective is that a person, a human being, should be defined as someone who can contribute to their own existence. I want you to think about that definition. A human being is someone who can contribute to their own existence. And therefore, a newborn would not be able to contribute to their own existence. So the authors go on to say that if there are troubling economic circumstances, or the child is going to live in unwanted circumstances, or the child has Down syndrome or some physical deformity, that society should be able to call for an after-birth abortion. Now, they make the case, these scholars do, that the argument that they're making is largely not new. And man, are they correct about that. This has reared its ugly head all through human history. The problem is obvious, I think, first of all, but the problem is that if you can kill a human being after it's born, and an infant, because it's undesirable, because it's economically troubling, because it's deformed, because it's, going to be raised in less than opulent or even favorable economic circumstances, then why can't you do that at any time during that human being's life? Now, I argue, and I think most folks who are pro-life argue, that human life is sacred. Those of us who are faith-based, who are pro-life, believe, of course, that human beings are made in the image of God. And therefore, to kill a child after it's been born is nothing but murder. Once a child's been born, in fact, of course, my view is that it's murder to do it in the womb once we know that life is there, because life in the womb is sacred also. But let's go ahead with our argument for just a moment. If you can kill a child who's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days old on the basis that they can't contribute to their own well-being, that they can't make a contribution to their own existence, well, of course, obviously we can draw parallels with the elderly. We could draw parallels with someone who is in a coma. We could draw parallels with someone who's temporarily disabled, temporarily endured some kind of a brain injury or something. I mean, when you start defining life or life that ought to be allowed to endure on the basis of whether it can contribute to its own existence, you have really redefined life. And the other thing, too, is that who gives the state the right to make these decisions? Who says the state can intrude in my family? Suppose, God forbid, I have a deformed grandchild. I fully intend to care for that grandchild or love that child. Suppose one of my 2 children, Jonathan or Elizabeth, had been deformed. I mean, my son Jonathan was born with a cleft lip. Does that qualify? Does that mean that he's not to be allowed to live because he doesn't maybe at birth look like a magazine cover? Where's the line going to be drawn? And I would suggest, and many of my pro-life friends would suggest, and of course Francis Schaeffer and others were suggesting this a generation ago, that once you shift the lines from what you might call the natural lines or God's lines, if you believe that, or the clear lines of viability and existence, once you shift the lines of the definition of human life from where natural law, so to speak, would define life, birth and death, then you really have created a monster, so to speak, and you are putting human life in great danger before the state. I mean, this is barbarism. This is what the Roman Empire practiced. When in the Roman Empire, there was the law of paterfamilias. A child could be brought to a father. He could literally signal thumbs up or thumbs down. If he signaled thumbs down, the child was exposed on the city walls, and we have records of babies being exposed, by the hundreds on the city walls, or thrown off of bridges into water, into rivers down below. This was the way it was in the Roman Empire. So what these medical professionals are urging in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and by the way, they defended it, for those of you who would like to look it up, in the British Medical Journal blog, is essentially exactly what the Roman Empire practiced, which was infanticide. But what they're doing in this case is they're redefining the very definition of life. Now, I want you to think about the people that you know who were born with some defect that was obvious to the doctors as soon as they came out of the womb. That child, according to these professors, these respected medical professionals who have written in one of the most esteemed medical journals in the world, are arguing that a child after birth with a defect ought to be killed. In fact, a child after birth without a defect ought to be put to death if the state or the doctor or some medical committee so chooses, based on economic circumstances, etc. This is not science fiction. This is not just a horror story, and this is not that isolated. Even the writers themselves say this is some of the commonly accepted view that's existed over the years. Well, yes, maybe in Nazism and other places. So I urge you to pay attention to these sort of cutting-edge cases, these sort of avant-garde articles and legal rulings and opinions of leading thinkers, because the lines are being moved in our society. Once we legalized abortion, we began to we put into the hands of the state the right to define what life was and the right to define when it could be taken. Now, initially that was voluntarily by a mother, but in time that line has shifted, and you are not far, I think, from some landmark cases about taking the life of the elderly, taking by state mandate the life of those in comas, taking the lives of those who are in some way temporarily damaged, and certainly taking the lives of those who are newborn and show some defect or are going to grow up in less than ideal circumstances. This is a move towards barbarism. It's dangerous, and even if you're not pro-life, even if you are in favor of abortion, of children deformed or unwanted in the womb, I'm even willing to let go of that argument for the moment, although everyone listening knows that I do believe life in the womb ought to be protected. The fact that now that's been extrapolated to allow for the taking of a child after it's born, I think ought to give everyone pause, even including those who are pro-abortion.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times bestselling author, a popular speaker, a frequent faith and culture commentator on Fox Cable News and CNN, and a blogger for the Huffington Post. His groundbreaking books on faith and American politics include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Faith of Barack Obama, and the upcoming The Mormonization of America. You can learn more about Stephen at www.mansfieldgroup.com or connect with him on Facebook and on Twitter under the name Mansfield Writes. The Stephen Mansfield podcast is produced by Isaac Darnell for Chartwell Literary Group.